You are listening to Russia on the Record, a podcast from the Moscow Times. Today, April the 26th, marks 38 years since the worst disaster ever at a nuclear power plant, Chernobyl. In this episode, we're going to discuss what nuclear energy represents for Russia today, and also its underexamined role in the country's foreign policy. But first, here's what happened in Russia this week. Russia's Deputy Defense Minister, Timur Ivanov, was arrested and faces up to 15 years in prison for taking bribes in the highest-profile corruption case in the military since the start of the war in Ukraine. Ivanov, who oversaw construction, housing, and property management for the armed forces, has been linked to Russia's reconstruction of the occupied Ukrainian city of Mariupol after it was destroyed by Russian forces in 2022. An investigation by Alexei Navalny's team detailed Ivanov and his family's lavish lifestyle. The surprise arrest signals Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu's weakening position as Putin's new presidential term begins. Ramzan Kadyrov posted a video of himself exercising in a gym after the independent outlet Novaya Gazeta reported that he was seriously ill with pancreatic necrosis. People have long been speculating about the health of the Chechen leader, as he often looks very unwell in his many social media posts, with puffy eyes and slurred speech. Novaya Gazeta said he has been receiving treatment at the Central Clinical Hospital in Moscow, which treats Russia's political elite, since 2019. A Russian man was sentenced to 5 years corrective labour for comments he made during a Vox Pop interview with the US-funded Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty news outlet. Yuri Kakhovets violated Russia's law against spreading so-called fake news about the Russian army when he told Russian reporters that while a de-escalation in the war was necessary, it was started by the Russian government. Our government says that it wants to fight nationalists, but it bombs shopping centres instead. Our military men from the republics of Buryatia and Dagestan shot civilians in the Kiev suburb of Bucha for no reason, he said. The Russian Orthodox Church has suspended a priest who presided over a memorial ceremony for the late Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny last month. The church's leader, Patriarch Kirill, is a close ally of Putin and has described the war in Ukraine as a holy war. The Moscow diocese did not give a reason why Dmitry Safronov was demoted and moved to another church. But as well as having performed a memorial for Navalny 40 days after his death, which is traditional in the Orthodox faith, Safronov was one of a group of priests who demanded Russian authorities release Navalny's body. He also reportedly refused to recite a prayer for Russia's victory in Ukraine. And US President Joe Biden has signed a bill authorizing $61 billion in military aid for Ukraine after months of partisan infighting put Washington's support for Kiev at risk. The State Department later confirmed that the US had sent long-range ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, something they previously said they would not do because, with their 300-kilometer range, they can strike targets in Russia. While Washington says Ukraine will receive the aid soon, its delay has left Ukraine in a vulnerable position, notably unable to protect its major cities and infrastructure against Russian missile attacks. The consequences of the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located in northern Ukraine, are immense. According to official data, more than 8 million people in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were exposed to the resulting radioactive pollution. Politically, it has shaped the global perception of nuclear power, and some people even think the disaster played an important role in the fall of the Soviet Union 5 years later. For decades, a 2,600 square kilometre exclusion zone has been placed around the nuclear power plant and the abandoned city of Pripyat. But it made world headlines again in 2022, when the area was occupied by Russian troops in the early days of the invasion. Another Ukrainian power plant, Zaporizhia, has also been the subject of global concern recently as it sits on the front line of the war, where it is at risk from drone strikes. Our guest this week is Vladimir Slivyak, co-chair of the Russian environmental group Eco-Defense and winner of the 2021 Right to Livelihood Award. We discussed what lessons Russian authorities have learned from the Chernobyl accident, the state of nuclear power plants near the war zone, and the importance of nuclear power for today's Russia. 38 years after the Chernobyl disaster, how do Russian people today feel about nuclear power? And what lessons have been learned?
Well, Russians been skeptical about nuclear power mostly, obviously because of 1986, the largest nuclear accident in history, the explosion at the fourth unit of Chernobyl nuclear power plant. But it's also true that Russian government wants to hear from people that they support nuclear power. So you might eventually read about some kind of public opinion polls which suggest that people are positive, but I don't think it's true. I think the truth is that young people don't really care about nuclear, and Russians are mostly old people, remember very well what happened in Chernobyl, and they are skeptical. The other thing that they probably do not believe that it's possible to stop nuclear power plant construction if something happening next to their house. So in that case, they would be skeptical, but they wouldn't voice any opposition because they don't believe in success of a protest anymore. I wouldn't say there were any lessons learned in Russia after Chernobyl disaster. I mean, the first few years, the Soviet government was very much worrying about consequences of Chernobyl accident, and construction of nearly all new nuclear power plants in Soviet Union was stopped in the end of 1980s. But then the country collapsed and it emerged the independent Russia, and politicians had to deal with a lot of other things. They didn't pay that much attention to nuclear anymore. And Russia was extremely poor at that time, back in 1990s. So there was not much of a nuclear construction happening anyway. And public opinion was very strongly negative about new nuclear. But again, anyway, government didn't build anything in 90s anyway. And then later, the time of Vladimir Putin started in Russia. And Vladimir Putin, it appears, a big fan of nuclear in all regards. So when Vladimir Putin came to power, nuclear industry started to benefit a lot from the state support, and they got unlimited access to funding, and they started to build a lot of new nuclear power plants in other countries and sometimes in Russia as well. And while sometimes they did public opinion polls, but it would usually be the same as before. The people are skeptical, but well, it also pretty much depends on what exactly do you ask. If you ask people whether they like nuclear reactor in backyard, they definitely say no. And if you ask them something about, I don't know, nuclear in space or how good is nuclear power in general, they might say something different. But I think the safety level in Russian nuclear power industry remained pretty low in 90s and later, and it's pretty low until today, which shows that there was no lessons learned. And that's my conclusion from watching Russian nuclear power industry for the last 30 years, how they've been handling issues related to public opinion, what's been happening with nuclear safety standards and stuff like that.
If we start to think about the war in Ukraine, how was the exclusion zone impacted when Russian forces occupied it during the early weeks of the full-scale invasion?
Well, the exclusion zone around Chernobyl nuclear power plant contains a very big amount of radiation. But this radiation is inside, it's in the soil. It's, well, mostly covered by the grass, so it's not distributing. Not distributing around in the environment. It was contained there before war. That's why there is exclusion zone, actually, because there is high radiation in this. And then when Russian army came, they started to dig the soil there, and it ended up with a big amount of radiation released to air, and there was redistribution of radioactive contamination after Russian occupation of exclusion zone near Chernobyl. And I don't think it's possible to do any serious research like how big the territory with new radioactive contamination is, because we would have to wait until the end of war in Ukraine to do research like that. But right now, we can definitely say that some amount of radiation that's been contained in the soil before war in Ukraine was released, and probably some new territories are radioactively contaminated now. So the exclusion zone might get actually bigger than it was. But it's just my guess.
International watchdogs have raised alarms about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, which is currently under the control of Russian forces. How well protected is this power plant, and what are the risks if something goes wrong?
Well, the civil nuclear power plants are not protected in this case in any way, because it was never designed to sustain some kind of a military attack. I mean, it's not military nuclear power plant, it's a civil nuclear power plant. They are designed to produce electricity, and there must be a very serious watchdog working at the nuclear plant to look, after all the safety issues and everything. And what's happening right now because of war in Ukraine at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant right now is basically very close to disaster. I mean, every time the high power line, the line that supply electricity to nuclear power plant, every time it's somehow broken or switched off, the risk of a new nuclear accident is growing dramatically. And of course, this is a really, really bad idea to attack nuclear power plant. It doesn't matter who exactly is doing this, but if it's happening, it just shows that people doing this, they do not really care about nuclear safety or anything, and they just doing those attacks to actually provoke nuclear accidents. I mean, it's still very hard to identify who's telling what, because sometimes Rosatom is saying it's Ukrainians sending drones and somehow bombing nuclear power plant, and the Ukrainians respond that they didn't do this. I mean, it's hard to identify where the truth is. I would guess Ukrainians are telling the truth, because I cannot see any single reason for Ukraine to provoke nuclear accident at this nuclear power plant. At the same time, I might think of a few reasons for Russia to keep the high level of hysteria around this nuclear power plant. But of course, I don't know exactly who's doing this. But this thing is like really, really dangerous. It may lead us to another great nuclear accident. Well, probably that could be the second one, largest one after Chernobyl.
Zaporizhzhia, of course, isn't the only nuclear power plant in Ukraine, and there are also some in Russia within the range of Ukrainian drone strikes. How well protected are they?
Well, they are not protected by design because it's a civil nuclear plant. So that means that, well, if somebody decides to provoke nuclear accident or even organize like blowing of nuclear power plant, theoretically it's possible if somebody wants to do this. But I mean, you can put like army there, you can try to protect it, let's say physical protection. That's possible to organize, but still, those are civil nuclear power plants. They cannot be fully protected against military attack if such attack happens. I mean, of course, when we speak about possible nuclear accident, it depends on what exactly is going on. Maybe one bomb or one missile hitting the nuclear reactor won't destroy it, but if somebody wants to destroy it really, then they could send 10 missiles or 100 missiles. I mean, in the end, reactor will be destroyed. So there is no like a protection against bombs and missiles if somebody really wants to destroy this nuclear power plant.
European countries, at least before the war, would ship their nuclear waste to Russia, and a lot of Russian environmental groups would protest very noisily against this. Is there any real harm from these shipments? And once they reach Russia, how is the nuclear waste handled?
Well, safety level in Russia is very low, in my opinion. When we're speaking, for example, about uranium waste that's been transported from Germany and from Netherlands in the past, it's been happening basically since 1996, but the last shipments happened back in 2021. And we've been trying to raise this issue in Russia, and we did criticize nuclear power industry over low safety levels when it comes to storing those nuclear waste. I mean that, for example, containers are corroded, And even if one container would be opened up for some reason, well, let's say because of corrosion, it may get destroyed by corrosion. If it happens, then it's a little danger for people at the distance of up to 30 kilometers from those containers. Well, in my opinion, Rosatom never did enough, never invested enough money, never took it seriously enough. I mean, the safety of storing radioactive waste it imports from other countries. And that's why it's been all the time criticized by environmentalists, but not only because containers are stored not in the right condition, basically under open sky and corroded, but also because in general, importing any kind of radioactive waste from other countries, it's a crime against future generations because, I mean, nuclear industry today is making money on this, but then later thousands of future generations will have to pay to store it safely and will live with the risk of radioactive leakages from those containers. So from an environmental point of view, it's a crime to import radioactive waste, regardless of how you store them later.
The nuclear power industry is one of the few Russian industries that hasn't been hit by Western sanctions. How can this be explained?
Well, it's absolutely true. There is no sanction against Rosatom, not a single sanction on the EU level so far. And the reason is very simple. At least 5 countries in the European Union very much dependent on a Russian nuclear fuel for their power plants. And there is no alternative supplier for such fuel. And that's for a reason that historically only companies that's been building certain types of reactors been capable of producing fuel for those reactors. So even if those 5 countries, it's Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Finland, even if all of them want to get rid of all contracts with Rosatom, for them that means stopping nuclear power plants, and obviously they want to avoid stopping nuclear power plants because for some of those countries it's a very, very big source of energy, and again, they don't have alternative supply of this energy. Well, in my opinion, the danger is so big that it's better to stop cooperation with Rosatom, even if it means shutting down nuclear reactors. I think that it's possible to create a plan for all European countries together, how in this case the new energy could be supplied to those countries who are shutting down nuclear reactors. I mean, well, for example, before war, Germany was very dependent on Russian gas. There was 60% of all gas imported in Germany was coming from Russia. If you would ask before February 2022 anyone about whether Germany can quickly replace Russian gas, everybody would say no. And what we saw is that by the end of 2022, Germany stopped importing any Russian gas. It was not easy to find an alternative, but they did. And I think, well, it's not easy to find an alternative for your energy production if you shut down nuclear reactors, but it should be possible. But still, back to the issue, there are 5 countries that are very much dependent on Rosatom. They don't want to switch off their nuclear power plants, and they do not have alternative sources of nuclear fuel for it, so they continue to buy it. And they made it clear that they will block all proposed sanctions against Rosatom as long as they do not have another source of nuclear fuel. There is French company Framatome and American company Westinghouse that are promising to those countries to start supplying alternative fuel probably even by next year, which is, in my opinion, pretty much optimistic, but that's what they publicly said. And, well, if it happens, then probably the last obstacle on the way of sanctions against Rosatom will be removed, and we will have to see what happens in 2025.
Is Europe dependent on Russian nuclear fuel? Also, Russia's nuclear agency Rosatom has partnered with a lot of international projects across the world, like constructing new nuclear power plants in China and Egypt. What does this tell us about Russia's nuclear strategy abroad?
Basically, the whole strategy changed when Vladimir Putin came to power back in 2000. Well, he became a president in 2000. He became prime minister in 99. And Vladimir Putin has this idea of geopolitical influence, and he needs an instrument for geopolitics. And he looked at nuclear industry as a very important instrument to grow his political influence around the world. And how they are doing this, well, it works pretty good with especially poor countries and not developed countries, but it also works with relatively wealthy countries like members of European Union, like Finland or Hungary. And it works like, well, once you start cooperation with Rosatom, basically, I mean, if you are some kind of another country and you start cooperation with Rosatom, you order a new nuclear reactor from them, you are getting chained to Russian nuclear industry in basically the Vladimir Putin regime for the next century or even more than century. Because, well, first you would have to spend 10 years or 15 years to build nuclear reactors, then at least 60 years when those reactors will be in operation, and they will be probably extended for another 30 years, and then it will be stopped, and then you would have to decommission it, and the decommissioning will take a few decades as well. So when you calculate, you understand that, well, when any kind of country gets involved into this, they are chained to Russia, geopolitically, but also like in general sense politically. And those countries become dependent on Russian nuclear fuel supply, on the Russian engineers, in general, in broad sense, on Russian technology. They start to send their students to study nuclear physics in Russia and all other things. And also a lot of contracts around the world Rosatom was able to get for one very simple reason, because it's the only nuclear company in the world that has unlimited access to a state budget. I mean, there is no other companies that's building nuclear reactors around the world who have such unlimited budget. So when French or American nuclear companies wants to build, I don't know, China, India, you name it, going to some other countries and planning to build their reactors, they would have to go around asking different commercial banks and different governments to invest into their project. And a lot of projects been stopped in the past because there was no money, because investors, especially private investors, are very skeptical about nuclear, and there are good reasons for it. But Rosatom doesn't have this problem. Vladimir Putin gives them as much money as needed. And that's for a very simple reason, because Rosatom is a geopolitical instrument of Kremlin. By building new nuclear power plants in other countries, they are helping Vladimir Putin to obtain more political influence in those countries. And then he can use this influence in any kind of way he can imagine, whether blocking some kind of sanctions in the EU or organizing majority for some kind of resolution in the UN, or opposite, blocking some real resolution in the UN. There are very different ways how it can be used. I mean, if you've got the influence, how you can use it politically.
That's all for this episode of Russia on the Record. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow the Moscow Times on your favourite social media platforms to make sure you don't miss the next episode.